Yuji would awaken in a river made out of blood. Currently, he was sat upon a raft. As he recognized what this was one of the nightmares he had seen so often. As he began to look around, looking back into the river, he saw something that was bone-chilling. Hundreds, no, over 1,000 faces made from the blood of Yuji's river. During the time that Sukuna was in control of his body, he ended the lives of a lot of people, and each of these faces were a person that Yuji killed. However, because of the fact that it was Yuji's own blood that killed them, he was able to recognize each of these faces. Their faces were forever engraved in Yuji's mind. And all of these faces, every single last one of them, were all staring up at Yuji. It was then Yuji felt a hand made out of blood grab his hand, as well as a tendril made out of blood grab at his leg. Yuji quickly looked behind him to see where it was coming from, to see a familiar body, but not one that Sukuna killed, but it was one that Yuji still blamed himself for the death of, which the body was a replica of Junpei's body, but fully made out of blood. With glowing red eyes, they slowly rose out from the river. As the voice then spoke, saying, "What's the point of going back? You're only going to cause more deaths of people close to you, just like how you killed me." His tone was dead and cold, as now they were trying to pull Yuji into the river, as Yuji would have began to resist against it. He didn't want to give in fully. He still had people he needed to live for. He couldn't die yet. Then he felt another hand grab him as well. This time it was the grip that belonged to a sorcerer. However, the hand and texture felt rather old, as an old man with a beard and mustache made completely out of blood conjured behind him, this being a conjured version of Naobito that was also trying to pull him in. As he then heard several voices from the river say, "You are a curse on the world, so let yourself be taken. Don't go back, as you will bring nothing more than pain and strife like you already did." Yuji couldn't just let himself die yet. He still had things to live for, people to live for that he would need to go back to. But these were thoughts that were still present in his head. He knew all of this was happening in his head right now. He just needed to not give in, before feeling another hand grab onto his neck from behind, to begin pulling him in, or at least trying to. This hand was also notably familiar to him as well, as it was the hand of one of Yuji's biggest failures. A familiar voice echoed as they said, "The longer you live, the more mistakes you'll make. You could have stopped the culling games from happening if you just killed me, but no. You wanted to put your own sense of justice, which truly was revenge in, which led to all the consequences." It was a blood version of Mahito that was also trying to grab him and pull him into the river. "Let yourself die and never cause any pain again." As several, no, all of the people that Sukuna had killed in his body began to work to start pulling away at Yuji. Hundreds of hands, each trying to pull him in at once. Yuji activating flowing red scale stack in order to try resisting against that hold and continue to live on, but it was to no use, as he was pulled right into the blood. This was also causing some issues in the real world as well, as Yuta could feel his RCT's effects starting to get a bit weaker. Yuta then explained, reverse curse technique on others is harder because of several aspects. One of these include if Yuji refuses the treatment, and everyone there's eyes widen in shock and worry. As Toto then realized what was going on, as he looked over to Yuji before saying to them, he's debating on whether coming back to life or not is worth it. This wasn't a surprise to any of them. Even Yuta was able to tell through his battle against Yuji was debating on if living was worth it or not, because there were a few times where Yuji hesitated because he was debating on if his life and staying alive was worth it. Everyone was now beginning to think on ways they could potentially help Yuji. One of them had to come up with an idea, and this was when Nobara came up with hers. Through the 9 days they were training with each other and killing cursed spirits, she found out quite a bit about the death paintings, including how they shared dreams. So she thought that maybe if they fell asleep, they'd be able to go into Yuji's dream and help him, since he was unconscious right now. And while that was certainly a good idea in theory, Choso shook his head as he looked to his brothers before looking back to Nobara. Recently, we haven't been able to connect to Yuji in his dreams. We don't know if it's because of his mood or because of Sukuna being powerful enough to shut it down, but we haven't been able to connect. And it was pretty clear they all hated this. They didn't know how to help Yuji or how they could even try and help him right now. The only thing they could do was put their faith in Yuji that he would be able to do this. Yuji was now starting to resist. He was trying to fight back and tussle against all of the hands pulling him down, but it was too many. Too many were trying to hold him down and pull him down as he felt himself starting to lose breath. He was getting closer and closer to his final breath. And as Yuji looked up, he would see another entity, but this one was different. Unlike the others, it was made from dried blood, being almost pure black in color, other than glowing red eyes as well as fists covered in that same red. But most notably, he recognized exactly who this was. This was him. The same Yuji from those nightmares and what he was afraid of becoming. A threat to everybody around them, a monster of power, a weapon to be used by their enemies, as well as a ticking time bomb waiting to be unleashed. As this creature got closer to Yuji, gripping onto his arms rather tightly, almost like he was trying to push Yuji down into the river to force him to continue to drown. He didn't want to accept it, not now, not after everything that had happened, as the whispers that existed in his head were turning into shouts that were all shouting to let himself die. Yuji's own head was his own worst enemy right now, until words echoed through his head, words of one man whose death he didn't feel guilty about. The words of his grandfather, which guided him on his life, which guided his goal of being able to give people good and satisfying deaths, as well as to help people because he was strong. It was all clear in Yuji's head now. He was trying to fight back against this for so long. He was trying his best to not become what he was afraid of, but he had been approaching this wrong. The only way that he could continue to help others was by accepting the fact that he could become a monster and taking it as his own. It would be him who would control his fate. He was a man-made monster, but it would be him who decides how he uses that power. As the blood river stopped, before erupting with all the people who were trying to grab at Yuji being sent backwards, before returning back into normal blood in the lake, other than one, the other Yuji, as they stared down towards Yuji before they began to shift, shifting to a red liquid that surrounded Yuji's body. However, it wasn't trying to hurt him. Instead, it was becoming one with him. Yuji still felt guilt from everything Sukuna did and not being strong enough to stop him. That guilt would never leave him, but the desire to let his own life end to no longer be a threat was silenced once and for all, as Yuji began to reawaken once more, looking around to try and figure out where he was. And when Yuji woke up, he would see all 10 of his brothers nearby, worried for their brother, as Yuji was embraced in a rather big group hug by all of them. Up to this point, they had all been incredibly worried for Yuji. They thought that he had died, as Yuji looked around to see what type of area that he was in, and he was in a ruined building with what looked like a bonfire in the center. He was confused about where he was as everyone let go after in order to let Yuji properly wake up and just adjust to everything. Alongside his brothers, he would also see that Mimiko, Nanako, and Nobara were all here. After having a couple more moments, Yuji finally told his brothers what had happened, the dream he had, and his new purpose, which hearing that did make everybody happy, especially Todo due to having this talk with Yuji a day before, but also had another side effect. All of them were gaining even more motivation from seeing that spark of fire and determination in Yuji's eyes. After everyone finished getting caught up with each other and things began to calm down, Yuta decided now was the perfect time in order to start explaining why he was attacking Yuji and what their plan was, as well as explaining that to every other sorcerer here present. While he could have interrupted earlier, he honestly didn't have the heart to do so. As Yuta first started by explaining why he was here, which was because Gojo had trusted over them to watch over the rest of the students if something had happened to Gojo, which Yuta figured the best way to watch over them would be eliminating the threat that was the higher-ups. And that did make a lot of sense with Yuji as well, which would be a good reason to explain why he allowed Naoya to live in order to report that back. However, he then heard the voice of a man who he had recognized, another friend and ally of Yuji, Megumi Fushiguro. As he then went on to explain the culling games, how his sister was ensnared into it and that he needed Yuji's help in order to save his sister, Yuji nodded. He was going to make sure that she would be saved no matter what. As both Yuji and Megumi felt an arm wrap around their shoulders as a familiar face came in between them, that one being Nobara Kugisaki, as she told them that it wouldn't just be Yuji's strength that would be helping, but Nobara's as well. Sure, Yuji might be ahead of them right now, but that was only for now. All three of them were going to work together to save Tsumiki. As Yuji then made another choice before looking over at Todo and asking him for an odd request, to give him the 2 fingers that he hadn't consumed yet. Yuji knew by this point his body had fully adapted, and he was near certain that if he were to consume both of those fingers at once, he would be able to make sure Sukuna didn't take control over his body, though he was still planning to make sure to space them out between days just in case, just to make sure that Sukuna didn't have a chance at all to take over his body. Which led to Todo nodding in agreement and passing the 2 fingers over to Yuji. Yuji then consumed one of the fingers while having the other remain in his pockets, the tattoos rising out for just one moment before vanishing. He didn't twitch. Sukuna didn't even have a chance to take over this time. However, Yuji internally could feel that smirk of confidence and intrigue on Sukuna. Yuta in particular was impressed. He had faith in Yuji, but to actually see it was something else. Megumi and Yuta then began to explain their plan to everyone in the group. First, they needed to head back to Jujutsu High in order to get to contact with Tengen. Furthermore, Yuki was already there waiting for them to arrive, which could help them to find out even more about Tsumiki. They needed to find a way to get Gojo free and fix the culling games. The issue was they had no idea how to actually get to Tengen. Or at least they didn't until Choso added in that he might have actually had an idea on how to get there. During the Goodwill Festival, Mahito had a way to bypass the doors of the barrier. Fortunately, Choso had overheard the way and could explain to them how to do so. And with that, the group of 17 sorcerers would all make their way to Tengen's base. And once they arrived to the location, they did see some familiar faces. Nanami Kendo, who had also been healed, but was covered in bite marks from Dagon's domain. He unfortunately was unable to heal his eye, but other than that, he was actually doing pretty fine. But considering the high amounts of death that happened in Shibuya alone, getting off with only losing an eye was definitely better than most others. Yuki Tsukumo and Maki Zenin were also here, which was a shock to Yuta, as he had actually expected Maki to have left by now, but Maki explained that she wanted to wait until they had a proper plan before heading to the Zenin clan household in order to try and get her weapons back. Finally, and what was the biggest surprise, was Kamo Noritoshi, who was wearing a necklace and reading up on a book right now. Most people here didn't recognize the necklace other than Yuji Itadori, who sent a nod over to Kamo, realizing exactly what that necklace was, which did cause a soft smile to rise on Yuji since those were nice familiar memories for him. As Yuji moved over to Nanami to talk with him for a bit and catch up, he had missed him since Nanami was his first official teacher. With Kamo being his main teacher, he talked with the two of them. As both Kamo and Nanami told Yuji they were proud, he had done well and had surpassed both of them. They knew if they had to fight Jogo, let alone the beast that was Mahito, they would not stand a chance, but also they told him they were proud of Yuji for being able to overcome his demons. But that was when Maki crossed her arms as she looked over at them and said, "Surprised to see Geto's two kids are here." As she sent a glare over to Mimiko and Nanako, Maki had recognized them on the spot. Yuta did as well, but he didn't feel a need to call them out about this, with Maki making a comment that she thought that they would be allied with Geto and not be allied on their side. However, their response was rather simple, as Mimiko said, "That bastard is not Geto," returning the glare back to Maki, as Nanako then said, "We're here to help kill him. You're welcome for help taking out that other curse." There was a clear amount of tension between the three of them that was likely not going to fade away for a while. This is when Yuki lifted up her hand as she told them to calm down. This tension is exactly what Naruto Kamo, the old one, wants. They needed to put this behind them for now. If they wanted to kill each other after, they could do so later. The three of them decided to agree to that for now, though it was also pretty clear that Maki was still suspicious of the two of them. After that exchange though, Maki looked over to the other people there. She had recognized Choso but not the others. She also still had no idea who Choso was, which led to Yuji explaining that these were his siblings, also having Yuji have to explain that he was a deaf painting and that he was half curse, half human. And upon hearing that news, a look of surprise entered onto the sorcerers that were already here before Yuji and his group arrived. Excluding Yuki Tsukumo, of course, who was already prepared and had met them back in Shibuya. After all, she was the one who actually told them and explained to them where to stay in order to make a small refugee camp if they were going to stay in Shibuya for longer. The group then entered into the Tomb of the Star, needing to split into 3 groups to go to the elevator. This is primarily because they had a group of 21 sorcerers, including several who were much larger due to being more like cursed spirits than humans in shape. They almost needed to take 4 groups of people, but they managed to figure out a way to do it with just 3 groups of people. And once they entered the barrier, all they would see is a white void, and they were confused. But before they could exit and think this was just a waste of time, they heard a voice stop them that said, "Leaving so soon, child of the Zenin, child of the Kamo, Michizane descendant, deaf paintings, and vessel of Sukuna," which caused them all to stop in their tracks and look over to the person who was talking to them. This person was Tengen. This then leads into most of the meaning with Tengen going very similar to how it would in canon, such as finding out that the real name of their opponent was Kenjaku, the one that was currently present and possessing Geto's body was Kenjaku, which did also help with the name distinction because they had to make it clear all the time which Kamo they were talking about since both Kamos were named Kamo and Narutoshi. They also then come to know that Tengen is immortal, but they still do physically age, which is why they look the way they do, with Kotsuzo making a joke to Toto that Tengen kinda looks like a thumb. And while they did definitely want to learn more about Kenjaku's objectives and how to open the prison realm, to get that information, 2 of them would need to stay behind. Between Yuta, Kotsu, Yuki, Tsukumo, and the eldest death painting. It was a surprise they didn't ask for Yuji, but the reason was because of the massive risk that was keeping Sukuna near them despite the level of strength that Yuji had. This also does lead into some confusion rising among them as well. After all, based on what they knew, Tengen was immortal. Why would they need guards? This led to Tengen explaining Kenjaku's plan to turn themselves into the merger in order to awaken jujutsu sorcery all across Japan. Also leading to them explaining how fate had gotten broken by Toji Zenin so long ago. They knew they needed Gojo back. Gojo was the key to solving this issue and ending the Culling Games once and for all. That was the thought that echoed through all of their heads aside from Yuji and Yuta. Yuta felt a need to be able to become strong enough to deal with this entirely on his own. He didn't want to have to put this burden on Gojo. Yuji was in a similar boat, but he didn't want to be the only person with that strength to deal with it. He felt that he needed to help all of his friends and comrades become strong enough to be able to take on this burden with him. However, both Yuji and Yuta were similar in one aspect. They wanted Gojo back due to Gojo being their friend and mentor, so they were going to make sure that Gojo was saved. However, they could all see how massive a threat this was, and considering this was basically their only option in order to get Gojo back, Choso and Yuki agreed to stay behind. Choso because he wanted a better chance to kill Kenjaku, and Yuki because they still had things to talk about with Tengen. Eso, Kechizu, Naranzo, and Tanzo decided to stay behind as well, to try and offer any support they could. Tanzo's ability of Blood Mist was going to be useful as well as Naranzo's Acid. Nanami also stayed behind, as he felt this might be a better way to help rather than going out. Finally, while Mimiko decided that she was going to stay behind in order to help, Nanako was not. Nanako felt she owed a debt to Yuji, as without Yuji she'd have been killed by Jogo, but she also was able to help him with another aspect. Yuji did not have a domain expansion, but Nanako was very good at making sure domains didn't activate through preventing them from making hand signs. So she felt that her curse technique being used in tandem with how strong Yuji was would definitely be very beneficial for him. Then she was certain that her technique and strategy would not work against Kenjaku. After all, Kenjaku did watch that entire fight happen and had Jogo under their control. There was no way that Kenjaku was going to fall for the same tactic with that amount of knowledge under his belt. Especially considering they wouldn't have the surprise factor on their side either, since Kenjaku would very much be on guard and prepared for their existence. Tengen did give them one more bit of info in order to help them. There was someone who could potentially help them with freeing Gojo from the prison realm. Because while Gojo did seal away or destroy every single curse tool that could help and potentially nullify this curse technique like the inverted sphere of heaven and the black rope, there was a sorcerer that was reawakened in the coming games that would be able to help. This was a sorcerer known as the Angel, who had the ability to extinguish barriers, extinguish cursed spirits, as well as nullify cursed techniques. That was going to be who they were going to have to go after. Now the hard part was they actually didn't know what she looked like, but they knew they were going to have to find her if they wanted to free Gojo. So going into the Culling Games, they had a total of 2 objectives. The first objective was to overall get 400 points in order to add in the 4 rules that they wanted to add. And the rules that they wanted to add were rather simple. One rule was to allow the players to leave the Culling Games, and another rule was to allow the transfer of points between players to be possible. However, Yuta then brought something else up as well, that they still had one more ally that they wanted to get. One that according to Yuta Akotsu was just as strong, if not stronger than he is. Because while they weren't short-handed, having as many allies as possible would certainly be good for them. This person being Hikari Kinji, the 3rd year that was expelled during the Night Parade of 100 Demons. This led to them deciding that the people that would be best to send after them would be Megumi and Nobara in order to go recruit Hikari, where they meet up with Panda during their time there. Originally, they were planning to send Yuji as well, but with the destruction that Sukuna caused and the fact he did it with Yuji's technique as well, they decided it would be too risky to send Yuji in because there was a pretty good chance Hikari might end up recognizing them. And if Hikari recognized them, there was a pretty good chance that Hikari might think they are working with the higher-ups, which would likely end any connection with them. Nobara was basically an unknown coming from a normal sorcerer family, so it was very unlikely that Hikari would recognize them. After all, it wasn't like she was famous or anything like that. Though that comment in particular caused a glare to rise from Nobara, however, she just had to accept that for now. It was an advantage that she was going to have. However, she knew for a fact that once this was done, she was going to become famous. She was going to be one of the greatest Jujutsu sorcerers of all time. Sanzo and Shozo decided that they were both going to go with Megumi and Nobara in order to give them some backup as extra muscle, which did lead into Megumi asking what their curse techniques were, with Shozo explaining that he was able to create blood clones of himself. However, the blood clones were stationary and more so made to be diversions rather than actually assisting in fighting. As Sanzo, the silhouette looked a lot more like a skeleton wearing a bunch of normal clothes, explained that his technique allowed him to create several limbs made out of blood, with Shozo explaining that he was the 5th brother and that Sanzo was the 7th brother. While in the bar, Megumi, Sanzo, and Shozo would go after Hikari Kinji, the rest of them were splitting off into different groups. Yuji, Todo, and Nanako were planning to head over to Tokyo Colony 1 and 2 in order to try and scout them out a little bit and figure out which colony would be the best for them to go into. Yuta was planning to head over to the Sendai Colony in order to attempt to get points. Kamo and Tanzo would head to the Sakurajima colony where they would meet up with Maki after Maki located the weapons from the Zenin clan in order to add more to her arsenal. Once Nobara, Sanzo, Megumi, and Shozo were done, Uiui would teleport them to the Lake Gosho colony while Hikari and Panda would head into Tokyo colony number 2. However, one of the Death Cleanings were thinking something to themselves. How could they help? This brother had taken on a form a lot more similar to that of a slug. This was Shouso, the 9th brother. They did want to go as well, but he felt he was a bit too weak to go with them. He was going to try and train himself up to get stronger, as right now he was barely on the level of semi-grade 1. With what opponents they were going to have to face, he would need to get stronger. As we now return back to the Kamo clan headquarters, with Kenjaku currently sitting down, a hand on his cheek as he had been able to watch the entire battle between Yuji and Yuta. He had left behind a cursed spirit in order to watch the battle as he wanted to see Yuji's progress. He had also watched Yuji during the entire 9 days, having the cursed spirit subtly follow them in order to get an idea of how strong they were. As Kenjaku then said out loud, Yuji's progressed quite a bit. I honestly wasn't expecting him to be that powerful, especially considering his mental state is still hindering him. While he started to use lethal techniques near the end, he chose not to use Flowing Red Scale Burst. How curious. Though Yuta Akotsu has also become a little bit more of a threat. He's now gained access to Naobito's curse technique, which is going to be much more difficult. I will admit, I am a little impressed he managed to turn one of my own weapons against me by using Kurorushi. I must admit, they are doing quite well. So now let's see you take on the next steps. Cause I did add some more precautions in order to help you improve, my boy. All the while, Kenjaku was now preparing himself in order to head over to Tengen. He would need to find them and capture them in order to add them to their arsenal. As now everyone sets forth with a goal in mind, as we now enter into the culling games.